Right. What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. And part of that is bringing you guys Richard Carrier to respond to a number of questions that Bart Ehrman got. We're going to be discussing both the questions that were selected and also Bart Ehrman's responses, because he had a number of doozies in my opinion in that particular one. So
yeah, quite. I'm just anyway. We'll get into it.
yeah. So I do have clips ready, which hold on one second. I got this first one
I want to touch on is
okay. So I have all of these clips organized, and so what we're going to be going through is Bart Ehrman, like the questions to Bart Ehrman and Bart Ehrman's responses, obviously, but we also have one extra bonus clip and some questions that I managed to pull out from the comments that we can address. So anybody that sends like a super chat question or whatnot will get first priority on questions, and also the Skeptic Mafia, they also have priority on questions. I put out a post for them to ask some questions tonight. Hadn't looked at them yet because I usually like to go into those blind. And so I'll be pulling those up. But anyways, I'm assuming, Rick, you're ready to get to this first one, right?
Oh, sure. Yeah, let's roll.
Okay. Before we begin, Rick, do you want to tell everybody where like they can find you and stuff?
Oh, yeah, of course. RichardCarrier.info. So RichardCarrier.info. All things Richard Carrier you can find there. So my blog, my courses, my online courses, if you want to take those. My books, if you want to buy my books, if you want to become a Patreon patron, there's certain perks for that. You can check that out. And all my feeds, so Facebook, Twitter, etc. All housed out through that.
Yeah, I think if people join your Patreon, don't they get to comment on your blog posts, and then you usually interact with every single
without moderation,
comment, right?
So most people will post a comment, it'll sit in moderation possibly for weeks depending on how busy I am, whereas if you're a Patreon supporter, if you post a comment on my blog, it publishes immediately. And in fact, if you are a Patreon supporter and that doesn't happen, talk to me and I can get your email address on the whitelist, and so it'll automatically post. So you can actually immediately engage with people. And I found this super cool. When I'm super busy and I can't look at comments, someone will publish something and it will get up there, and then my Patreon patrons can go in and respond to it, and they carry the water for me. And they often have like amazing, like really good comebacks and really good analysis and links and things like that. So I find it really valuable. Because I figure if you're serious enough that you're willing to pay even a little bit of money, you go out of your way to do that, to support me, your comments are probably going to be of higher quality than most folks. And I've noticed that is actually the case. So it's well worth it. But that's just one of many perks, is you get to auto post comments on my blog without moderation.
Awesome. Okay, let's get into this. I've got several clips, so we'll just get right on into this first one right here. And this I'm starting from the very beginning. I do have some choice questions that I kind of get closer to like a good question, but some of these are just bad.
Before we start the clip, I just general observations. I was watching this and I've seen two of these videos now from Holy Koolaid, right? Is who we're talking about. I really feel like he's phoning these in. Like his questions are not informed. So like he doesn't even understand the question he's asking. Like he'll ask, even like if there's someone, a commenter puts a question in and the commenter doesn't know what they're talking about, or they misstate something. The host should actually know how to reformulate the question to say like, oh, I know what this person's asking. They should be informed, right? And then of course, when Ehrman answers, like Ehrman has no idea what he's talking about. Clearly doesn't know it's more and more examples of he doesn't know my work, right? So he doesn't know what the argument actually is. And he responds to the formulated question, which is terribly formulated. And so he spends like 5 minutes ranting on this thing. And I was like, you're wasting everyone's time because no one disagrees with you, Bart. Because that's not the question. That isn't actually the argument being made. Is he'll refute this argument that no one makes. And then we'll laugh and act like, oh yeah, I refuted the mythicists. It's like, but if you knew what you were talking about, you would know you weren't refuting the mythicists because you would know that's not an argument they make. And in fact, what he would do is he would come back and say, actually, that's not the argument that they make. Here's the argument that they actually make, and here's my response to that argument. Right? That's what like someone who was actually competent and gave a damn about what they were doing. And so I find this very disappointing, and I chafe at how much money he must be paid to like come on and just waste everyone's time like this. And so a little bit of criticism for Holy Koolaid there. I think he's dropping the ball as a host. I think he could have done a much better job of formulating questions, being informed about the issues, so that he could ask like really more challenging, more directed questions at Dr. Ehrman, especially if he's paying to have Dr. Ehrman on to do that. Like take the most advantage of the time, like have a really well formulated question. And then when he gives you an answer that kind of evades the question, keep pressing the point. Like, well, actually that didn't answer the question. Or if the answer sounds dumb, like challenge it. It's like, that doesn't sound right.
Yeah.
And there's going to be some examples. We're going to get to some examples. I have a list of things that I wanted to talk about, but we'll see just from the clips that you give where these things go. So that was my preamble. I was very disappointed and kind of frustrated by this Q&A video, frankly.
Yeah. No, I am right there with you. I was pretty confounded myself.
Confounded.
With the questions.
I love that word.
That
is excellent. Yeah. Yes. And even if so, shout out to Myth Vision. When Derek does this, like he actually can restate the question because he knows, like if a questioner asks a question, he says, well, that's not well formulated. He knows what he's talking about, right? So he's read Bart Ehrman, he's read my work. So like he can actually reformulate the question and make it a better question that really probes where, really challenges us. And so that's an example of like a good host. And I don't know if I don't watch Holy Koolaid's channel regularly. I don't know if he's phoning in all his podcasts, but these things with Bart Ehrman, especially because this is a very rare, unique opportunity to have this interview with Bart Ehrman. Like you should up your game, not down your game. Right. That was the thing that kind of surprised me. And I was listening to the whole thing, the whole video, and I'm like, I'm waiting for like something good, like a good question, like a challenging question, like, oh yeah, okay, he's got a good point there. Or that is the point that you should needle or whatever. And no, it's just, they're terrible questions. And then Bart Ehrman, like his answers were phoned in even, like Ehrman is phoning it in even more. I was really sad with, like, we're not getting good answers from him. Anyway, I shouldn't rant about this. We should give examples. So let's proceed.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Okay. So here's the first question, which isn't that great of a question, but we'll get to some better ones.
The first thing I want to touch on is I got a comment that says, I have no problem accepting that there were a bunch of itinerant Jewish rabbis wandering around the Holy Land 2,000 years ago, or that many of them were apocalyptic preachers looking to expand their various death cults, or that the story of Jesus is an amalgamation of stories based on these men. I have a huge problem with the idea that any of them were divine. Is that what you're arguing?
I want to stop right here at first because this
characterizes what I was talking about.
Yeah.
How does he not know that Bart Ehrman is not arguing for a divine Jesus? And I'm just astonished by this question. Why is this question even here? Anyway, proceed. What were you going to say? What was your point?
Well, my point was that this is a common thing that's actually said that I found in my comment section, but I always just immediately dismiss those because it's fairly obvious that we're not talking about the divine Jesus. And there's a lot of people out there that are like, look, I'm fine with the Jesus existing, but that doesn't make him divine. It's like, well, I know, but we're actually talking.
I'm one of them, right? I've said that too. Yeah. Like 1 in 3 chance, so like pretty good odds. No, and I think if people haven't watched the video that we're clipping right here, immediately before this, the host went on a long discourse about how this is about mythicism and the pushback from mythicists. And so this is going to be Q&A about mythicism, why are you wasting 5 minutes of time about whether we believe that Jesus was God? That's not the debate we're having. We're like everyone in this debate agrees that Jesus is not God, that he's not a divine person. The debate is entirely about whether this mundane Jesus, non-divine Jesus, whether he existed or not. Now, to Bart Ehrman's credit, like I think his answer, he immediately tries to turn it back to what they're supposed to be talking about. But the question should not even have been asked. You should have skipped this question and gone immediately to the next one.
Right. And honestly, I thought about even skipping this question, but there are a few things that Bart Ehrman says in his response.
Valid point. Yeah. We're going to see that in a moment, right?
Yeah.
No, I don't think Jesus is divine. No, of course not. No, I'm a historian. I'm not a Christian. If I believe Jesus was divine, I'd be a Christian. I'm not a Christian. I'm skeptical of much of the Bible. I think that a good deal of the historical narratives in both the Old Testament and the New Testament are not historical. They're not historical information. And this seminar I'm doing is going to be talking specifically about the birth. What can we say historically about it, and what appears to be legendary? Most of it is legendary, and so I have no problem with that. But that's a very different calculus from saying that there never was a man Jesus. I do not think that he was an amalgam of a group of people. We don't have good information about these groups of people. What we do have good information of is a single man, Jesus, and we have numerous sources that talk about him, that are independent sources of one another. And so the point I made in my webinar is the same.
So I wanted to stop right there because
he's going into a standard rant of how there's all these sources that don't exist. But yeah, proceed.
Well, yeah. So I was just gonna say the independent sources that he's talking about, at least as far as I can tell from
they're not independent.
Stuff.
I think I'm shocked that he keeps saying this. It's as if he doesn't understand what the word independent source means. And especially because he goes into like the whole idea of historical methodology. I am a historian. I have a PhD in ancient history from Columbia University. In fact, one of my specializations was historical methodology, ancient and modern. So I know this issue. So independent means actually independent. We don't have any such sources, shockingly, but explicably. Like if Jesus was a kind of a nobody, if he was a lesser version of all these other messianic figures that we're going about, then it makes sense that he wouldn't show up on the radar of the world. So I don't think the argument from silence is very strong against the historicity of Jesus. But we've got to admit that we don't have independent sources. You can't find a single example. Every source we have can be linked back to Mark, knowledge of Mark. There's really just one source. Or Paul, and I know Ehrman gets into why he thinks Paul is referring to a historical Jesus. So you at least have those. You have two, right? So you've got like Mark and Paul. And that's it. Everything else is derivative of them. Derivative is not independent.
So and he says this in other discussions that he's had on this particular issue, but he actually thinks because he doesn't say like the Gospels themselves are independent, like attestations. What he does is he speculates and makes up like imaginary sources, and then claims that they are independent.
Yeah, it might even be the next sentence in this clip, I think, or very nearly, because I know he says, "Oh, we have Q, we have L, we have M." It's like these are things you made up. We don't have these things. These are hypotheses. These are sources you've hypothesized exist, but you don't have any. You don't have the sources, and you don't know they exist. There's no evidence that they do. And I actually have notes about what he said about Q. Hopefully you've got a clip on that, because that I was flabbergasted by his really shallow, uninformed attempt to argue for Q.
Mm-hmm.
Always make, and people don't want to hear it. But if you're looking for historical documentation of a figure from first century, you have very few people in history who are documented the way Jesus was. And so you can disbelieve it if you want, but I don't know what kind of historical evidence you would hope for other than what we've got, because it's a lot. I mean, again, I'm not a believer in Jesus, but I'm just telling you the evidence is a lot.
Ooh, pause it right there. Yeah. I've written a lot about this. So I have a whole chapter on it in Jesus from Outer Space that pulls together blogs I did. Because I kept getting people asking me, like, well, what about Hannibal? Well, what about Spartacus? Well, what about Pontius Pilate? Or what about Herod Agrippa? And this whole list of people. And so when Dr. Ehrman here says, what evidence would you want? That whole chapter is about that. So what we have for Socrates would be enough. That would settle the issue. What we have for any of these other figures, Hannibal, Spartacus, Pontius Pilate, Herod Agrippa, Caiaphas, even. We have more evidence for Caiaphas than we have for Jesus. So, like, you know, and I've gone into the detail of, like, yes, I have actually answered this question, is what is it that we would want that would convince us, the doubters, that Jesus existed? And it's not a lot. We're not asking for absurd amounts of evidence. It's the same kind of evidence that we have that convinces us of all the existence of all these other people from the ancient world. And it's evident from Dr. Ehrman's discussion here, which is fairly recent, and every other time he discusses this, that he has no idea what we're talking about. He never listens to us. He never reads anything we say. He knows nothing about what I have said on this issue. Because he's acting like this. So he doesn't know that we've actually answered this, Dr. Ehrman. We've told you what evidence we would need. How does he not know that? And why isn't he answering that question? Basically, it's like saying, like, it's like, oh yes, okay, so I know what you said about what we have for Socrates and why it's convincing, and we don't have that for Jesus, but here's why we should still believe in Jesus, or believe that Jesus existed historically. That's not what we get from him, which is what we would get from, like, a competent, serious historian who is actually taking this argument seriously. But we never get that from him, even after time and time again. And because this is time and time again, for the host in this case to not make the point I'm just making, right, and say, like, okay, look, we've heard this from you time and time again, but you're missing the point of what they're saying. Here's what they're saying. What is your response to what they're actually saying? Can we move this conversation forward instead of repeating over and over again these misinformed, ignorant, kind of naive responses? And that's what I would want if someone's going to get Dr. Ehrman on their show today. Like this is like, what, a year ago? Not even a year ago. This is what we should be doing by now. Like, because we've had this conversation over and over and over again, and we never get anywhere. We should be able to get somewhere. Like, there's enough information out there for a host to get somewhere on this conversation. That's what I need to happen, and it's not happening here.
Right, I agree. Godless Granny in the chat did have a quick question asking, what area of history is Richard Carrier's specialty?
So Roman Empire, early Roman Empire in particular. When I went through the PhD program at Columbia, we were doing it a little bit differently than they usually do. We had 4 PhD majors, which are major topics that you specialize in. Mine was early Roman religion, early Roman historiography, early Roman philosophy, which includes science at the time. And then my 4th major was the crisis, century of crisis, which is the 3rd century. I specialized in basically the beginning of the end of the Roman Empire. And so those are my 4 majors. My dissertation was on the scientist in the early Roman Empire. So sociological history of who these guys were, what they did, and what achievements were made, and so on in science. But one of my majors is ancient religion, and obviously one of the major religions of the early Roman Empire is Christianity. So that and Judaism and paganism is one of the things that I studied for my PhD degree at Columbia.
Yeah. All right. So that's it for that clip. And thank you so much for answering that on the spot question from Godless.
Yeah, happy to. Anytime.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get the next clip up. I think maybe we could do this one.
Also a mention of a different Jesus in Philo of Alexandria, when one of my commenters talks about a Jewish angelology that's written by Philo, in which Jesus was firstborn of a god and God's high priest. Are there other figures like that they could be pulling elements from? I've also heard a take that Jesus is influenced by Greek mythology, and they're taking stories from these influences from the surrounding cultures.
No, that.
Carrie, do you have any initial thoughts about this particular question before we get to Ehrman's response? Oh, sorry, you're muted.
Yeah, of course I do. Were you watching when this came out? Were you watching the chat screen? Because I didn't see this live. So did you see the chat? I want to know if Thomas
no,
is actually
he didn't.
Is he reading the actual question, or did he reformulate the question?
No. He's directly reading the questions.
Okay.
He's got a list of questions.
Yeah, but they're coming from other people, right? They're not.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't formulate them. Yeah, that's what I was wondering. Yeah, because that's. So there's two things here. One, that was badly formulated questions. So it kind of really compresses a bunch of issues with Philo, and is too vague with the based on Hellenistic mythology and stuff. So the thing that I would expect, though, as you would see with me, like if something like this happened with me and I was the one being interviewed here, I would know what they were talking about, right? I would know, oh, okay, that question wasn't formulated well enough, but I've read what Richard Carrier said about Philo, so I know what the actual argument is. And so what I would do is I immediately say, okay, well, here's what the actual argument was. Here's my argument against it, right? So that's what we should be seeing from Dr. Ehrman here. Instead, he's completely clueless. He has no idea what Thomas is talking about. He has no idea, evidently, what I've written about Philo, which isn't exactly what Thomas said. It's kind of vaguely close, but not quite. And so I wouldn't, if Ehrman was someone, let's say Ehrman had never heard of me and Thomas had asked this question, I would be sympathetic with Dr. Ehrman because he would have no idea what the hell he's talking about, right? I was like, what do you mean Philo, Jesus and Philo? I don't know what you mean. And so it would be unproductive. But by this time, there's no excuse for Dr. Ehrman to not know what my whole section on Philo is and what relevance it has and so on on the historicity of Jesus. He's claimed recently that he read the book, but he should know what this is about. But it's clear from his response that he has no idea what Thomas is talking about.
Right.
That's absolutely right. But the thing in Philo, if somebody said that, tell them to send me a note and tell me what reference they're talking about in Philo.
Okay.
Yeah, so that is the correct response to someone who'd never heard of me and didn't know what he was talking about. But at this point in history, Dr. Ehrman has heard of me and claims to have read my book. So he should actually know what he's talking about. But this is a reveal. This is a tell. This tells us that Dr. Ehrman has never read my book. He has no idea what's even in it. Or my blog. But I don't expect him to read my blog. But at least he should have read the book by now. So he had no idea. And this is why, like, a good host would have reformulated the question to say, oh, you don't know what I'm talking about. Okay, so let me explain. Like, here's the argument as presented, not as the questioner presented it, rather than just trust the questioner. Thomas himself should know what he's talking. Like, he should have read my book. He should know, like, you've gone through all the trouble of having Dr. Ehrman here. He should know how to formulate the questions. So he should be able to say, oh, okay, so there's a section in the book where Dr. Carrier argues that there is an archangel of many names that Philo talks about that has all the same attributes as Jesus, as depicted in Paul. And he even implies, he doesn't say outright, but even implies that there's a reference to a Jesus character in the Old Testament. Is this archangel of many names? And which would be an interesting coincidence, right? So so you could actually have that conversation. And I wrote an article about this. Larry Hurtado tried to respond to me on this. But again, he didn't read the article. He didn't read the book either. He responded to third-party telephone gamed versions of my argument and then wrote this huge rant about how I'm an idiot and got everything wrong and made a bunch of really embarrassing assertions that were easily disprovable about what Philo never said. And it's like, there's direct quotes that Philo said these things, right? He said, Philo never said that. And I'm like, I have direct quotes. There, it's in the standard literature. It's not right. So I go and I wrote an article about the difference between being a historian and being an apologist. And Larry Hurtado in that moment was acting like an apologist. He wasn't doing the research. He wasn't actually reading the source materials. He was just issuing kind of like a rhetorical rant against something that he spent no time studying to even know what he's supposed to be responding to. And that's embarrassing. And it's also, there's no reason to do that. Why would you do that? You're Larry Hurtado. You're a freaking erudite scholar with huge qualifications, you know how to go look at the peer-reviewed literature and say, okay, here's the argument, here's why I disagree with it. But that's not what they do. They just make shit up, and contrary, and it's completely uninformed, contrary to the arguments that's been made. It's not even responding to the argument that's been made. So Thomas should know that, to the point where he can say, well, if Bart Ehrman just told me that he doesn't know what I'm talking about, so it's like, okay, so let me explain what I'm talking about with the Philo thing and hear your thoughts about it. Now, that would still be unfair if it were the case that Dr. Ehrman had never heard of me and had no chance of reading that book before now. It would be unfair to like throw that at him all of a sudden, because it's like, I don't know. I'd have to go read that peer-reviewed book and see what the argument actually is, and then I could come on and respond to it. That would be an appropriate response for Dr. Ehrman to say. But instead, he just, I have no idea what you're talking about, and moves on.
Yeah, and considering that Bart has written like it's a pop level book about the historical Jesus, or the question, did Jesus exist? I mean, I would have expected him to at least know about this particular like facet of like mythicism.
Well, he wouldn't,
even if it's just a surface level.
To be fair to him, he wouldn't have known that when he published that book that you're talking about, which is Did Jesus Exist? Because that came out, I think, in 2012. Mm-hmm. I think I sent him a manuscript of On the Historicity of Jesus in 2013, and then it passed peer review and was published by Sheffield Phoenix Press in 2014. So his book would not know about the Philo stuff. But okay. What is this, 8 years ago now? Yeah. He's been asked this question so many times since then, and claims to have read my peer-reviewed book, the peer-reviewed version that he claims to have read. I mean, I know various times he's claimed to have done this. So he should know this material by now. That is absolutely true. There's no excuse for him to be acting like I don't know what you're talking about. I have no idea what reference in Philo that could be.
Yeah. All right, let's continue.
So no, there are lots of Jesuses in Josephus, but you know what? There were a lot of Jesuses who played shortstop and second base when I was a kid in the 1960s. I mean, there are a lot of Jesuses out there playing shortstop, and so it's a common name. It just means Joshua. So it doesn't mean anything. There are lots of people with this name. These other Jesuses that are talked about by Josephus are not Messiah figures, and there is one that has similar predictions of Jesus, in that he predicts that Jerusalem was going to be destroyed. Jesus of Ananias. But Jesus of Ananias was living decades after we started getting stories about Jesus of Nazareth. And so it's not
there. Yeah. There's a number of weird things going on here. He keeps calling him Jesus of Ananias. It's Jesus, the son of Ananias. I don't know how he doesn't know the difference. That's weird. There's 20 points of connection, not just that he predicted the destruction of Jerusalem. There's 20 points of comparison that actually line up weirdly in the same order, even between Jesus ben Ananias and Jesus Christ of the Gospels. And in the end here, he's about to go on this rant about how, Jesus ben Ananias was decades after Jesus, which is true, which means that the original religion can't have been based on Jesus ben Ananias. That is absolutely true. But the Gospels are all after Jesus ben Ananias. And I think there's a moment where Dr. Ehrman after this, where he kind of admits that the gospel stories, some of the gospel stories, the early gospel stories, borrow material from the Jesus ben Ananias tale. So I think he's not completely against that idea. And then he has this sort of valid argument about how that in and of itself would not mean that Jesus didn't exist, which I agree with. And I actually agree with what he started with in this answer, which is there's a ton of Jesuses. It just means Joshua. So that in and of itself is not super telling. You can't refute the historicity of Jesus with that. But what should be relevant here, he should mention that it doesn't just mean Joshua. What does Joshua mean? It means the Savior of God, right? God's Savior. And we're talking about God's Savior. So when you have a religion that worships God's Savior and that guy's name just happens to be God's Savior, it sort of takes away the impact of, oh, that's a common name. God Savior is a common name. It's like, yeah, but it sounds like they picked that name for a reason. And you pick names of people who don't exist. You don't pick names of people who actually existed. So there's actually an argument here that is completely missing him and Thomas, incidentally, in this whole, like, this could have been a better interview where Thomas could have made this point. It's like, yes, okay, yes, that Jesus is a common name, but isn't it a really weirdly convenient name for the Savior of God to be named? Like that's the argument that we should be addressing here. And you can come up with a rebuttal to that. Like, I don't think it's like an unanswerable argument, but at least get the argument right? Figure out what the argument is. And there were some other things he said in there that were kind of missing the point, but some of what he's saying is correct, right? I agree with him about that alone is not enough to prove that Jesus didn't exist. And that's why there's no peer-reviewed argument for mythicism that bases its argument on what we're talking about here.
Right. And I mean, I believe even in your book, you go into how really you just sort of rely on Paul's work. And because the Gospels can't really give us any clear information about like history,
reliable information. Yeah. Whereas Paul at least is close, right? He, as what Ehrman will say soon in one of these clips, I'm sure will come up, is Ehrman knew people who knew Jesus, right? And if Jesus existed, that's true. Paul himself never says that. Paul never says that these people knew Jesus in life. But if you assume that Jesus existed, then they must have done. And Paul did know them. So like that argument proceeds in that sense, but not the way that Dr. Ehrman frames it. He does there's another tell here where he says that Josephus never says any of these Jesus figures, the Jesuses in Josephus, never says they're messianic figures, which is true insofar as Josephus never says the name of any of the messianic figures that he does talk about is Jesus. And he does talk about a bunch of other people who are named Jesus who aren't these messianic figures. That is true. But I have a whole section on the historicity of Jesus that Dr. Ehrman would know about if he had read the book, where I point out that Josephus has several, and this is from the peer-reviewed literature by multiple other scholars. It's not something I made up. It's in the mainstream peer-reviewed literature. They've pointed out that there are actually several figures in Josephus who are all messianic figures in the sense that they all are acting apocalyptically and claiming to bring about the end of the world and the salvation of Israel, etc. And each one of them engages in some sort of action that portrays them as the new Joshua. So the original Joshua, what did he do? He parted the Jordan. He felled the walls of Jerusalem with a trumpet. He did all these like magical things. And these other messianic figures claim to do the same thing. They said, not the walls of Jerusalem. I'm sorry, the walls of Jericho. But there's a guy in Josephus who says he's going to magically fell the walls of Jerusalem. Obvious reference to Joshua felling the walls of Jericho, right? So there's where Josephus is deliberately crafting the story, or possibly these figures did. Josephus is just reporting what their propaganda was. That's entirely possible too. But they're very definitely selling themselves as a Joshua, and the new Joshua who's going to liberate Israel and do a Joshua-like thing, part the Jordan, topple the walls of Israel, or topple the walls of Jerusalem, etc. And so they do these particular things. But that means that Josephus understands, and he expects his Jewish readers, doesn't expect his Gentile readers, but he expects his Jewish readers to get what he's talking about. These are Jesus Christ, because Christ means Messiah. These are obvious messianic figures. Josephus is writing them exactly that way, that these are Christs, and they are Joshua's, Jesus's. So he's written it, but he's specifically avoided the word Jesus and Christ, right? Josephus specifically avoids those words, but he paints a picture that his Jewish audience would get, oh, that's a Jesus Christ. That's a Jesus Christ. That's a Jesus Christ, etc. And they're all messianic figures, and they're all Joshua-based figures. And I point this out, it's like, and so you could even use this to argue for historicity. You could say, like, well, Josephus records there's a bunch of these guys who are portraying themselves as Jesus Christ and trying to bring up and doing things that get themselves killed to bring about the end of the world. So you could say, oh well, if there's a bunch of guys like this, then the Christian history, the historical Jesus, fits this model exactly. He could have been one of these dudes, like one of these guys claiming to be the new Jesus, new Joshua, and Christ, or the new Christ figure, and he's going to get himself killed to bring about the end of the world, just like all these other guys. And you know, I have a response to that. I can argue why that doesn't hold up, and I point that out in the book. Like, it's not a good argument for historicity, but it's at least an available argument for historicity. And for people who want that argument, I paint it out in detail in my Wichita talk, which is "You're All Gonna Die" for Rapture Day, when Harold Camping's Rapture Day in Wichita. I gave a talk, and you can find it on Google. Just Google Richard Carrier, "You're All Gonna Die, Wichita." You'll get it. And I go into this whole talk where I go into pointing it out. All these figures that Josephus records, and there's a reason, a biblical reason why they were trying to get themselves killed and bring about the end of the world. You can build a plausible theory of historicity for Jesus, our Jesus, based on that model, that he was just one of these guys and he just wasn't famous enough to get mentioned in Josephus. Like, so Dr. Ehrman's been handed on a silver platter an opportunity to argue here against mythicism, but it would require him to have read my book. And he didn't. And so he says, oh, there's none of these guys in Josephus. Actually, there are. And it is mainstream literature today admits that there are. But he doesn't know what he's talking about, right? So he just argues from the armchair on this subject. Mm-hmm. And I know he knows how to not do that, right? So his book, Forgery and Counterforgery, and his book, The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture, these are masterpieces of historical analysis. Like, they show deep competence. So he knows how to do this correctly. He's just choosing to phone it in. He's putting no effort in to even understand what the arguments are or to research them for whatever reason. And this is deeply frustrating to me because I know he knows how to do it correctly. He's just choosing not to.
Right.
It just, yeah. So, what you can,
but I want to push back on that, because wasn't he the one who was like killed with a catapult or something during the siege of Jerusalem, or am I mistaken?
No, that's right. In the year 70.
So
it's true. I want to push back. This is what he pushes back on. This is super frustrating. It's like, oh, he's going to push back on something. And then he says this, and like, that is literally the least important thing to push back on all the things that have happened in this video. Anyway, I just had to comment because that made me laugh. I was like, oh my God, really? I was so excited when he said, I have to push back. I'm like, oh, he's going to do his job. No, but it didn't happen. Damn it.
Yeah, I don't understand how it's a pushback, to be honest.
No, it isn't, right? It's really terrible. It's really terrible. So keep running the clip. Let's see if Thomas actually explains what he's talking about. But for the audience, it is true. Jesus ben Ananias is crushed by a catapult stone. So that is true. Obviously, Jesus Christ wasn't. So that's not the relevant. That is not the relevant. I mean, they were both killed by the Romans, but that is not the relevant parallel here. But anyway, proceed.
If that's the Jesus that has some parallels with the Jesus in the Gospels, and many of the gospel, like for example, John wasn't written until around the year 90 after the fall of Jerusalem. Couldn't that have been pulling elements from that character, that sort of messianic figure?
Oh man, stop here.
Jesus is talked about by
this. I don't get. So Thomas says John was written in the 90s, which is fair enough, maybe. But he picks John. Why did he pick John? I don't understand. Why is he talking about the Gospel of John? And he says, well, John was written in the 90s after the destruction of Jerusalem. All the Gospels are written after the destruction of Jerusalem. So, and there's the parallels, the Jesus ben Ananias parallels are in Mark, and some of them get preserved in Matthew and Luke, but they're mainly in Mark. They're not in John, I don't think. Like, there aren't many in John. So I don't understand, like it doesn't look like John's even done like rudimentary prep on even gospel history. Like, he doesn't even know the actual historical sequence of the Gospels. He doesn't know the literature on Jesus ben Ananias and the parallels with Jesus, which have been published by multiple different scholars in the field. he's done no research on this. And if he'd read my book, he could have done, like, he would not only know what I've written about it, but he would have the footnotes. He could go read the articles by Whedon and so on, and be informed and be able to ask informed questions. But no, he, like you said, I don't know how is this a pushback? I don't know where he's going with this. So,
yeah, and I'm fine with the conservative, kind of conservative dating of John, but I think that I think that what he's trying to do is provide enough time between Ananias's death and when it could have affected the Gospels.
Yeah, but picking John is terrible for that. So, and I know the future. I'm from the future. I know what happens. I know what Dr. Ehrman's response is, and it's totally correct, because Dr. Ehrman's going to go on about how, like, I don't know what you're talking about. John's like way later than all these other gospel authors, and it's like, yeah, like that doesn't, like, defeats your purpose. Like, John's too late to be relevant to this. You can't say that Jesus was invented based on Jesus ben Ananias because John, like that I don't understand what Thomas even thinks the argument is. And Dr. Ehrman's response is totally correct. Like, he shuts this down, and I would make the same point that Dr. Ehrman does. It's like, that makes no sense. I don't know where you're going with this. But we can proceed from there.
Paul in the 50s.
But for the later writings, if they're taking stories of these other messianic figures.
Okay. The reason it doesn't work is because John precisely does not have that message that Jesus of Ananias preached. The earlier Gospels do. Yeah. And that message is found in the sources behind those Gospels. It's found, for example, in the Q source and the M sources and the L sources, and it's found in Mark.
My question, how does he know that this message is found in Q, M, and L?
Oh,
he can't know those things, can he?
No, and he's going to give an argument. I hope it comes up in the clips. And I'm pulling my hair out at the argument is, even Q scholars are going to be pulling their hair out at the horribly bad argument that Dr. Ehrman is about to give for how we're supposed to know that Q existed. But he just casually just throws out, not just Q, L and M. It's in the M source. It's in the L source. It's in Q. No, it's in Mark. It's in Mark. Everything else is a riff on Mark. It's just a riff on Mark. All the things that he's calling Q, M, and L, these are just redactions and riffs and developments based on the idea that Mark contrived. Because this is not in Paul. And it's interesting that Dr. Ehrman mentions Paul. Paul never says anything about Jesus predicting the destruction of Jerusalem or the Jerusalem temple. He does mention the end of the world. He says Jesus predicted the end of the world, and then Jesus is going to come down from the sky, and we're all going to fly up to be with Jesus. Like, that's in Paul. But he never says anything about Jesus predicting specifically that the Romans are going to come and destroy the Jewish temple. Like, that's not in Paul. It first appears in Mark. Mark invents this idea that Jesus predicted it, which is very typical for prophecy, that you retrodict. You have the prophet predict the thing after the thing has happened. You rewrite history, basically, and say, oh, our guy predicted that would happen. Like, that's common in history of religions. And so Mark does this. So he says, and a lot of what Mark is doing, the Gospel of Mark, is trying to explain why God let the Romans, these heathens, these pagans, to come in and destroy his house, and still the world didn't end, right? Everything's going on. Nothing's changed. Like, why would God let that happen? It doesn't this refute our entire religion? It proves that our God is fake. And so Mark is actually writing this whole story to kind of rehabilitate their religion and say, like, no, this is all part of God's plan. In fact, Jesus predicted it. It's all, the timetable's going. It's like, yeah, the world's still going to come. That world's still going to end. It's still going to come. So like the Gospel of Mark is all about this sort of apologetics for explaining how the religion can still be true despite the things that have happened. And so that's a point that Dr. Ehrman could have gone off on and saying, like, well, the religion cannot be based on Jesus ben Ananias because the religion predates Jesus ben Ananias. And I think that's kind of what Dr. Ehrman wanted to say here, and that's true. But that's not the argument that he's supposed to be responding to. The argument is that the historicization of Jesus, putting Jesus in history, interacting with Pontius Pilate, that's not in Mark. That's not in Paul. Interacting with Pontius Pilate is not in Paul. Interacting with Romans, not in Paul. Jesus walking around Galilee is not in Paul, etc. It's in Mark. But Mark is writing after Jesus ben Ananias, and he uses, and I think Dr. Ehrman seems to agree, like he kind of avoids this being explicit, but I think he kind of admits that the scholarship in the field has proven that the Jesus ben Ananias story did affect the telling of the tale of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark, which is true even if Jesus existed, which is the argument that Dr. Ehrman should be making here. He should say, like, well, yeah, the Gospels are building a story about Jesus. They're pulling ideas from a variety of different myths. They're using the myths of Moses to build out the nativity, especially since, you know, Dr. Ehrman's talking about giving a seminar on the birth narratives, the nativities narratives. He well knows that the Moses narrative is the thing that they're pulling from to build and invent a story about Jesus. And so he could say, oh yeah, Jesus ben Ananias, they're doing the same thing. They're borrowing materials from these stories to build stories about Jesus. But there's still a core that goes back to the original Jesus, who's an actual historical person. This is the argument that Dr. Ehrman here should be making. If he wants to make a good argument for historicity, he should be agreeing with Thomas and saying, oh yes, the Jesus ben Ananias story is influential in the gospel stories. But what I'm saying is that those are legends built on top of a simpler story of a real man. And then we can go talking about, like, how do we know that real man existed? What do we know about him, etc. That's the tangent that should go here. But that's not where Dr. Ehrman takes it. That's not where Thomas takes it. Like, neither of them seem to know what the hell is going on or what they're talking about in this context.
It might have been written somewhat a little bit after 70, but he wasn't living in Palestine, and the stories of Jesus of Ananias are found nowhere. So there's no way, suppose Mark was writing in Rome, as many people think, there's no way stories of Jesus of Ananias had reached Rome, because nobody was even talking about Jesus of Ananias.
Oh God, stop there, please.
Yeah, I thought that he actually kind of went a different direction.
This is so embarrassing. I missed this. I think I was distracted when this came up. Oh my God. All right. How do we know about Jesus ben Ananias, everyone? Children, little children, how do we know? Because it's in the Jewish War written by Josephus. Where did Josephus publish the Jewish War? Rome. When did he publish the Jewish War? Mid-70s. So this idea, like, where do you think Mark, if he's writing in Rome? We actually don't know that. I think that's kind of a typical traditional scholarly assertion that Mark is writing in Rome. We actually don't have any evidence of that. But even the Latinisms in Mark don't mean that he was writing from Rome. Latinisms could appear in every province of the Roman Empire. It's completely, there's no good argument that Mark is actually writing in Rome. But let's assume, even just from the premise is true, that Mark is writing from Rome in the 70s, as Dr. Ehrman said. How does Dr. Ehrman not know, because multiple articles in the peer-reviewed literature have said that Mark is getting this from the Jewish War, the book published by Josephus in Rome? That's how someone writing from Rome would know about this. It just got published, right? So my question is how does Dr. Ehrman not know this? I just don't understand. And worse than that, not only does he not know it, he claims to know that there's no way Mark would know it. Right? Rather than saying, like, well, actually, I haven't looked into this. I don't know where Mark could have gotten this. Or saying, like, well, according to the literature, Mark got it from Josephus, and the Jewish War was published in the 70s. So, you know, like, rather than doing something like that, he just absolutely asserts, no way, that makes no sense. It's impossible that Mark could be borrowing from Josephus, because how would he know from an author in Rome in the early 70s publishing a book about this? This is very frustrating, and I did miss this on my first review of the video, but yeah, that's terrible. I'm shocked.
Well, yeah. So from what he said earlier, just to clarify, he did say that this Jesus ben Ananias, his message that he preached appears in the Gospels. and that's when he got into it appears in the Q, M, and L sources apparently. So
Jesus predicting the end of Jerusalem, the destruction of Jerusalem. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So I do want to highlight a super chat real quick. Daniel M says, David says good night. He's not in bed yet. We're just eating at Cracker Barrel.
Watching this at Cracker Barrel? Is that what's happening?
Yeah.
I wonder if there are other people at other tables hearing.
I hope not, because Cracker Barrels are known for their prayer groups. So
well, I have the opposite attitude to that. I hope so. And I hope there's like the lone closeted gay person who's hearing this and like, wait a minute, there's reasons to doubt all of these things. And that it will lead them on a rabbit hole that will lead to their true salvation, which is liberation from religious ideology.
I agree. Well, so Daniel, tell David I said good night. I hope he sleeps tight and has a great weekend.
Awesome.
All right.
So, I mean, why would anybody think that a story mentioned by one source, Josephus, about something happened in the year 70s, influencing gospel traditions that are earlier than that?
Wait, whoa, stop there. I missed that too. Did Dr. Ehrman just say, he said gospel traditions. This is important. Okay. So he's not saying the gospels were written before 70. He's saying, I see where he's getting this. He's still hung up on the bad example. This illustrates the point you made before, that Thomas focused on the prediction of, actually Thomas said that he got crushed by a catapult stone. I don't know. That never comes up or is relevant here. Dr. Ehrman said he only focuses on this idea that they both predicted the end of Jerusalem, which is not the most relevant. It's one of 20 items that line up. But this is another example of Dr. Ehrman clearly does not know Whedon or any of the other literature that I cite on this, the other scholars who published on the Jesus Ben Ananias parallels. And if I were in this position, like I say, like, oh, is there literature on this? I haven't read it. I can't really comment on that. And even if I offered speculations, I would be framing them as, well, maybe there's something I'm overlooking because I haven't read the literature on this. But here's my immediate take on it. But I could be wrong, right? Like, because I need to go look at what Whedon has said. I need to go look at what Carrier has said and so on. That's not what he's doing. He's declaring adamant, omniscient, godlike knowledge that requires him to go nowhere further than his armchair, and making this sort of mocking, like the way, like all his emotional and body language here, right? Like the scoffs, the guffaws, the laughter, and so on. He's acting arrogantly like, oh, these people are idiots for suggesting this, where he's really slagging off like major, prominent, respectable colleagues of his that have published journal articles under peer review about this, because he thinks he's just talking about me or other mythicists. He thinks it's safe to do this. But no, he's clearly just completely dismissive of the literature of his own field and doesn't think that he even needs to consult it to have opinions that are completely reliable. And this is a common behavior of his that I see over and over again that is very frustrating, is unbecoming of a scholar. It's not, and I think we did talk about this the last video we did about the prequel to this video. We made I made the same point, and we're seeing more of that same behavior here that is not appropriate for a scholar.
Yeah, I do have to say that right now Ehrman has like a scowl on his face. Like he looks like he's very perturbed by just.
Oh yeah, he's right always now emotionally hostile when this subject comes up, and is in this posture. You notice he's like an unrelaxed, mocking, guffawing, laughing posture through the whole 20 minutes. Right? He can't just dial back and say like, oh, well, let's just calmly discuss this. No, he is in an emotional peak the whole time. And you can see that the way he behaves is like this. But this is not uncommon. You see this multiple times. He'll be doing a Q&A. He's totally calm and answering questions, yada, yada. Someone brings up mythicism and he just flips the lid. Like, he's flipping a grand piano. Like it's just like he can't hold it together. And you see this emotional reaction here. It's very condescending and dismissive and mocking. And it's not taking the questions seriously at all, even though I assume that he's been paid well to be here, in which case he should be taking these questions more seriously. Honestly, he should be taking this seriously, even if he's doing it for free, but especially if he's being paid. he should be taking this seriously. Like, say, well, you want like a serious, informed answer to these questions. That's what he should be doing, and he's not.
Right. Well, just so that everybody knows, all of the Bart Ehrman content integration that was going on at the very end of last year was him basically giving out free appearances.
That's what it was. Okay,
to push his seminars that he was doing.
Right.
And so it's basically just a big advertisement is what he's doing. That's why it seems,
which I don't object to. I think that's, well, I object to it being phoned in, but I don't object to the strategy of drawing attention to your seminars on the subject, even if it's for money. But even if I think Dr. Ehrman genuinely wants to teach people this stuff, especially about the nativity, for example, like he wants audience for that, for just legitimate scholarly and educational reasons. So I completely support that behavior. I don't think that's mockable at all.
No. So I'm perfectly fine. Like, I thought it was a really great strategy for him too. I'm sure that it really helped, like, getting in with
it gives you this rare opportunity that Thomas had here, that you really need to do your homework to take the most advantage out of this, because you might not get this opportunity again, right? Mm-hmm. Especially if he's doing it on your show for free, like that is a huge boon. But no, it's being phoned in on both sides here.
Yeah.
It's like a timing discrepancy.
Well, that's what history is.
Yeah.
I mean, history is about timing. If you have an anachronism, it's just, you're not going to say that whoever invented the microwave invented the person who influenced the person who invented the convention oven. It doesn't make any sense. And so, of course, it didn't happen. Trump didn't influence George Washington. So what? And so chronology is pretty important. Your earlier question, though, was about Greek mythology. And this is where it really is important, because in Greek and Roman mythology, you certainly have stories about divine men who are sometimes born of a union of a mortal woman with a divine being, who can do miracles, who are taken up to heaven when they die. And these stories, I think, almost certainly influenced the storytellers who are telling stories about Jesus. And so the big task for serious historians is to figure out, when you have stories about Jesus, what parts of these stories actually have some kind of historical merit, and which parts are legendary accretions based on the kinds of things people would say about someone like this. And so that's the historical task. Yeah. But it isn't done by simply kind of, picking stuff you like and don't like and throwing it out or keeping it in. I have very serious friends who have spent 30 or 40 years working on just this problem, who know Greek and Hebrew and Latin and Aramaic. I mean, like and so, it isn't just like, it's like Jesus. It's like, it doesn't work that way.
That's weird, but I agree with everything he said, right? Like that is, he's bringing it back to where the kind of arguments he should be making. Like, that is a valid argument. That's what you should say. It's like, yeah, actually, like, there could still be a historical Jesus on which all of this legend's attached. So here he's bringing it back to what I mentioned earlier is what the argument should be, which is that, Jesus ben Ananias was definitely used to formulate legends about Jesus, but that doesn't explain the origins of Christianity. It can't. And it doesn't prove that there's not a real Jesus onto which these legends are being piled. And so what Dr. Ehrman said right there is absolutely correct. And that is actually the kind of, when historicists are making that argument, I agree with them. In fact, I say this myself on the historicity of Jesus. Mythicists can go too far by assuming that, if the story of the crucifixion in Mark is based on Jesus ben Ananias, then Jesus didn't exist. It's like that's not a valid sequence of argument. Now, you can keep building on that to get a valid argument, but that by itself is not a good argument. And Dr. Ehrman is right to say that is itself not a good argument. But then we do need to get into the weeds of, well, how are you going to determine that anything in this legend is true, right? So, like, it's true that it's possible. Like, it's possible there's a historical man upon which all this is being piled, but it's also possible, equally possible, that there wasn't, right? So this is all myth out of everything. Moses was created out of whole cloth, Romulus out of whole cloth. We're pretty sure Dionysus and Hercules and so on are created out of whole cloth, probably Aesop and so on. So the question we want to ask is like, how do you tell the difference between these two things? And that's the conversation that we should be having here, right? Like, this is what I want to see from historicists is how do you do this? And in your answer, could you please respond to the criticisms that have already been leveled at what you've in the past said is how you're doing this? Q is a good example of this. Hopefully we'll get to the clip about Q, which really flipped my lid when we got to that. You do need valid methods. You can't use bogus methods. And he says, well, I know all these smart people who know all these languages that are doing this. It's like, yeah, but that doesn't mean anything they're doing is valid methodologically. They might be using faulty methods. And so we need to have that conversation. Are they? Like, how do we tell? And that's what I want to see to move the conversation forward is that, like, what are they doing? Why do you think that what they're doing is valid? And what do you think after the answer to your question, after that question is when you hear pushback, and you hear actual pushback, not Jesus ben Ananias was crushed by a catapult stone. Right. So, right. There's such an opportunity here that's slipping away and just completely lost. And I'm saddened by that, actually.
Yeah. Before we get into the next clip, Godless Granny has a pretty good question. She asks, I argue against Jesus' birth story based on date issues, but have a hard time supporting where Quirinius was from 4 BCE to 6 CE. I only have Wikipedia and the History Channel. What are better sources?
That's a great question, because that's the kind of thing, like, that's a super obscure question. Like, most people have no idea what you're talking about. I totally know what they're talking about. And I've spent a lot of time on this. So I talk about that in Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ. So my book, Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ, has a whole chapter on apologetics about reconciling the two nativities. So for audience who don't know what we're talking about here, the nativity in Matthew, the birth of Jesus in Matthew, and the nativity in Luke contradict each other historically. The things they mention as having happened 10 years apart. So they're both basically dating Jesus to different years. And so they've got 4 BC to 6 CE, that's it, right? So like Matthew is putting the birth of Jesus sometime between 6 and 4 BC. Luke is putting the birth of Jesus sometime around 6 CE. Now, that's assuming that either of these authors even freaking knew the chronology of what they're talking about. They might not have, but it doesn't matter. What they wrote is putting the birth of Jesus in these 10 years apart, and there's no overlap. They're 10 years apart. You can't pull them together. And there's tons of apologetics to try and reconcile this. This is one of the biggest contradictions in the Bible, one of the most difficult to resolve. So there's a huge apologetic literature with like 20 different attempts to make this work. And I actually spent a lot of my career in detail researching and rebutting all of these arguments, responding to them all. And I've assembled them all into a summary form in an article that ended up on the Errancy Wiki, which is now in Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ, where I go into the details on these issues. And so one of the questions here is Quirinius. So Luke says Jesus was born when Quirinius took a census of Judea. Well, Josephus, and actually more than Josephus, and several sources mention that Quirinius took the first census of Judea in 5 or 6 CE. In fact, we have coins that show the introduction of the Roman dominance of Judea start in 5 CE, 5 or 6 CE, depending on what calendar you use. And so Herod the Great has been dead for 10 years by then, right? So that's why Matthew's story doesn't line up with this. But a lot of the apologetics will involve like, well, maybe Quirinius took a census of Judea in 4 BC. You can't prove he didn't, right? Is the argument. Maybe he took 2 censuses of Judea. There are a number of reasons why that's impossible. And it's really goes into the details of Roman history, Roman political history, Roman administrative and bureaucratic history, and so on. I go into all of that. So people who are, and with cited sources and scholarship and so on. So people who are interested in answering that question, you totally want to get my chapter in Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ, because it not only details that one issue, it details all of them, like every argument that's ever been made to try and reconcile these two census or these two birth narratives. I cover there. I have an answer to everything pretty much.
Yeah, and Hitler Homo Bible Christ is always a good one. If you're looking for a pop level book on mythicism, though, that is a shorter read than On the Historicity of Jesus, it's going to be your Jesus from Outer Space.
Yeah,
right?
Jesus. I'll pull it out right now. Wait a minute, where's my? Oh, here it is. Yeah, you can see it is much more approachable, a thinner read, and yeah, that gives you a good summary of it, and it has a concordance in it to the bigger book. So if you see something in there and you want to see the scholarship, here's the huge, thick, ridiculously large volume on the historicity of Jesus. So there's a concordance in Jesus from Outer Space. So if there's an argument you see in Jesus from Outer Space, and you're like, well, what's the evidence behind that? I want to hear more about that. I want to see the scholarship on that. You can look in the back and you can look up the page number, and it'll show you what page number in the scholarly book, which has the footnotes and everything. And so you can actually use the two books together if you want to go that hardcore. But if you don't really care about going hardcore, JFOS, Jesus from Outer Space, is the best introduction, and it covers almost everything that comes up in here. I don't think I mentioned the Philo thing in there, but most of the stuff that came up in this talk is addressed in Jesus from Outer Space. So it is a good book to like read as a counterpoint to this, even without watching this video, frankly, with you and me whinging about these guys. But anyway.
Okay, so the chronologically speaking, as far as the question and answer thing goes, the next question or the next section is rather, I don't know, I feel like it's superfluous. It's the discussion on like Zeus and Jesus. I don't know if you really have any interest in listening to that.
I mean, I did listen to it. I don't know about the audience, but it was kind of a waste of time, I think. But
yeah,
I mean, if you have comments on it, you can play it and then we can comment on it. But
I don't really. It's just I'm as baffled by the entire thing as I think Bart Ehrman was on it. So, but I do have more important questions.
So for those who want a summary of that, I think he spent like 5 minutes, ranting about like, well, just because Zeus didn't exist, that doesn't mean that Jesus didn't exist, which is true. Like, it's almost like he thinks that mythicists argue this. It's like, well, Zeus didn't exist, therefore Jesus didn't. None of us, even the crankiest, even the biggest, most incompetent cranks among mythicism, do not make that argument. So I don't understand why Dr. Ehrman thought it was worth time spending 5 minutes ranting about that when it's an argument no one makes. So there's no point in rebutting it.
Yeah, exactly. This next one though is pretty pertinent, and I was at least surprised that he was thrown off by this, or he doesn't know more information about it.
Another one. Of course, Jesus never existed. Even Paul never puts him here on earth, but in a spiritual realm.
Oh yeah, where does Paul do that exactly?
And then he mentions.
Where does Paul do that?
I like how immediately defensive like Ehrman gets. He's like, "Who told you that? That fucker Carrier, didn't he?"
Well, and the thing is, like, you could answer this question. It's kind of moot to the argument, but you could answer the question. Yeah, Paul references Jesus being a celestial being, communicating to him from heaven multiple times, right? Like, I don't honestly think that Dr. Ehrman thinks that when Paul says that he's having this conversation with Jesus in 2 Corinthians 12, this is well after Jesus had died, the historical Jesus, according to Dr. Ehrman. I don't think Dr. Ehrman thinks that Jesus like descended from heaven, joined earth, and then came, like, visited Paul in this vampiric zombie body and had this conversation with Paul. I think even Dr. Ehrman would admit, well, obviously Paul claims to be having this vision with Jesus in heaven. He's talking to a celestial Jesus, right? So it's kind of offensive for Dr. Ehrman to mock the idea when even he himself knows that Paul understood Jesus to be in heaven. So Paul, like, what Dr. Ehrman should be doing in response to this, what his response should be is yes, Paul does understand the risen Jesus to be a celestial being, that he's in heaven, etc. But my position is that Jesus was on earth, and Paul thinks that Jesus went to heaven, and so then you could get to where Dr. Ehrman does eventually talk about what he thinks is the evidence in Paul of a historical earthly Jesus. It's nothing new. We've all heard it. It's stuff that's been refuted multiple times, and to which refutations Dr. Ehrman had never replies. But he could at least acknowledge, rather than mock the idea that Paul believes that Jesus lives in heaven, he could at least admit that even he agrees that, yes, at the time that Paul's writing his letters, he believes Jesus is in heaven. And when he's talking to Jesus, he's talking to a celestial Jesus. This is not controversial. There's no mainstream scholar who would disagree with this. But no, instead he mocks the whole concept. And I don't understand why do that. Like, why not just admit what's correct and then present what your modification to that view is? Instead of this, he just irrationally mocks the idea that Paul believes Jesus was in heaven. This makes no sense. Even coming from Dr. Ehrman, it makes no sense.
Right, because isn't one of the points that I think that Ehrman has actually flipped on is the idea that the Messiah archangel figure of Jesus is actually a pre-existent figure, even in Paul's time, right?
He previously criticized and mocked me for siding with, which was at the time a lot of peer-reviewed scholars arguing that Jesus, even Paul believed that Jesus was a pre-existent archangel. Dr. Ehrman mocked me for that, completely flipped on it, wrote a whole book defending my position on it, never apologized or corrected his criticisms of me on this point. But that has to do with pre-existence. But I think he would even agree with the post-existence, post-mortem existence. Dr. Ehrman has never advocated, nor would he ever advocate, that Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, was like the wandering Jew. He was like walking around earth for the rest of his afterlife. No, he knows that Paul understands Jesus to be in heaven at that point after resurrection. So there's no point in Dr. Ehrman to mock this view. He should be responding to it, which is different, a different reaction. He said, well, yes, Paul believed that the resurrected Jesus was in heaven. That is correct. But here's my reasons for believing that Paul understood Jesus to have been on earth before his death. And Dr. Ehrman throws out some of the reasons that he thinks that he doesn't seem aware of the rebuttals to those reasons, but he at least offers those reasons eventually. But at this one moment here, he seems to forget that even he agrees with what Thomas is saying. And his disagreement is actually on a different aspect of it. Again, related to chronology, which Dr. Ehrman just made a big issue out of. But anyway, so this kind of behavior is emotional and childish and unproductive.
Agreed.
I don't know. I'm just reading the comment.
Yeah, I know. Exactly. People say this. Like, Paul has Jesus being crucified in heaven. Okay? Show me what verse that one's in. Paul says he was born of a woman. He says he was born a Jew. He says that he had a brother named James. I mean, Paul talks about things that Jesus said. He talks about what he said at the Last Supper.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to stop right there because, I mean, especially with the Last Supper thing, Paul doesn't talk about there being a Last Supper. Like, no, that's not how he references it.
This is the equivocation fallacy you get from Dr. Ehrman all the time. He says, well, Paul mentions disciples. No, he doesn't. Paul mentions the Last Supper. No, he doesn't. Paul says that the Lord did a thing. The Lord told him that he did a thing. So this is a vision that Paul's talking about that resembles what later got turned into the Last Supper in the Gospels. So the significant thing here is these are passages that historicists cite in favor of historicity, and they were the ones that I took seriously and examined. And some of them I even count as evidence for historicity on the historicity of Jesus, on the a fortiori side of my margins of error. But he knows this. He should by now know that we have answers to all these claims. So for him to just casually assert these things as if we've never heard this before, like, this is actually how he's acting right now. He's acting like, well, they've never heard of these passages. Let me cite some passages at you. That's weird behavior from someone who knows that there are rebuttals to these and knows that this is a fruitless thing to say. You can't just keep repeating the argument that's been refuted. That is not a rebuttal. You have to actually respond to the refutations. And so he doesn't do that, or even acknowledge that there are rebuttals to what he's saying. And so for the audience who maybe don't know, I don't know if you have any audience who don't know this, but each one of the passages he's referring to in Paul, they're very ambiguous. They actually are not as clear cut as he's making them out to be, and they don't actually argue that strongly for the alternative view that he's pushing, or for the view that he's pushing. And so one has to actually address the things we pointed out. Like, this is one of the things when I got the postdoc grant to do the research on this, I was keen to actually find enough evidence that I could securely argue for the historicity of Jesus, because I thought, like, at the point that I was kind of in a liminal space where I was like, well, I've heard some good arguments against. I haven't heard good rebuttals to those arguments from the historicists. So I spent 6 years researching and saying, like, let me see if I can find those, right? Let's see, are there good answers to this? And I didn't. In fact, the further I looked at it, the weaker these arguments looked. Like, these are very apologetical, rhetorical responses to mythicism. They don't hold up on examination. They're actually much more ambiguous than is laid out. And so if you're going to defend them, you need to respond to the points that we've made about it, like why these are ambiguous. Like, why are you so confident that when Paul says he's born of a woman, that he's talking about an actual woman? When in the actual passage, like the actual argument, Paul almost, a few sentences later says, well, these women are allegories. And, literally he says, like, these women are allegories. And then it goes on, this is a problem, right? And so there's another example of he says James is his brother. Well, actually, Paul never mentions biological brothers of Jesus, but you know what he does mention? He has multiple times mentions that all baptized Christians are brothers of the Lord. He says, Jesus is the firstborn of many brethren. We are all the adopted sons of God. We all cry out, Abba, Father, upon our baptism, etc. So all baptized Christians are brothers of the Lord. And that's the only kind of brother of the Lord that Paul ever explicitly discusses. He never says anything about biological brothers of the Lord. So this creates a problem, right? This means that you can't just casually assert this verse as evidence. You've got a problem you have to overcome before you can actually use this verse as evidence for historicity. This is the actual argument that's happening in the world outside the head of Bart Ehrman. He's just completely ignoring the argument. He's not even engaging with the argument. He's just acting like the argument doesn't even exist. And this is unproductive. You can't move this debate forward if you're not even going to acknowledge that there is a debate, much less what it is. And so this kind of behavior really offends me, coming from a scholar who should know better.
Oh, yeah, I totally agree. And I was going to mention about the whole brother of the Lord thing. And I think is it Romans 9:25 where he also mentions the brethren of the Lord, maybe?
No, you're thinking
maybe not.
1 Corinthians 9, verse 5.
But okay, 9:5, not 9. Okay, yeah.
Correct. There are two verses where the full phrase "brothers of the Lord," baptized Christians as brothers, is all throughout the letters of Paul.
Right.
Fictive kinship terminology is all throughout the letters of Paul. But using the full phrase "brothers of the Lord" specifically appears only twice. And in both places, and this is the point I make on the historicity of Jesus, in both of those places, Paul needs to distinguish rank and file Christians from apostolic Christians, higher ranking Christians. And it's conspicuously only in those two places that you hear about brothers of the Lord. So that there's an issue here that needs to be addressed. Dr. Ehrman's just ignoring it. He's not responding to the argument at all.
Well, and I was going to ask you kind of sort of a technical question, but in 1 Corinthians 9:5, it uses the same root word for the believing wife or sister as it does for the brothers of the Lord.
Yeah.
And the argument that I generally get from people is that, well, in the Galatians 1:19, he's talking about like this phrase, brothers of the Lord, or the brethren of the Lord, is speaking exclusively about blood relatives. But would that, using that same logic, wouldn't you also have to say in this particular sentence that they were talking about like literal sisters, like blood relative sisters?
To be fair to the argument is when you append of the Lord, somehow magically you're talking about a different category of brother. And then it just happens to be the biological category, which is what I just refuted before. Is like, we know from Paul that if you append of the Lord, but after brother, well, the only thing that Paul references is cultic brothers of the Lord, not biological. But their argument would be that it didn't say sisters of the Lord. You know what I mean? So like they're saying, as soon as you say brothers of the Lord, now suddenly it's about biological brothers of Jesus, not fictive kin. And so more informed historicists, more informed anti-mythicists will acknowledge at least that point. They'll acknowledge that fictive kinship terminology is all throughout Paul. But their argument is that as soon as you add of the Lord, now suddenly you're in a different category.
Okay.
That doesn't necessarily follow, much less, even if it does follow, that the category is biological. And so that's the fallacy happening there. And sometimes you find versions of it where they'll say, well, the definite article means biological. I was like, nope, I can find tons of examples of the definite article not meaning biological in Paul. And so they'll come up with like, well, maybe this and maybe that. I'm like, nope. Sorry, all your armchair attempts to get what you want don't work. And I know I frustrated like you are. I tried to find something that would hold together. I looked at every thread and they don't hold up. And that's how I ended up where I am. It's like it just doesn't hold up when you check. It just doesn't hold up. And so that's how I ended up where I am. I think Dr. Ehrman's not even like a tenth of the way to where I am. Like he's assiduously avoiding even engaging in this fact checking and questioning.
Right. We do have a super chat from Daniel M saying, it seems to me Bart Ehrman needs Jesus to have existed for some reason. It wouldn't surprise me if he later joined Christianity, which is a little weird because he does actually come from a very like evangelical background.
Yeah, I disagree. I don't think this is evidence that he's gonna become a Christian, right? There are a lot of issues orbiting around Dr. Ehrman. One is he has an entire career built out of trying to reconstruct the historical Jesus, almost all of which he would have to throw in the trash if he were to suddenly admit that Jesus didn't exist. So he has perfectly ordinary secular career reasons to be backing the historical Jesus. He's also got a believing wife. Like his wife is a Christian, and he's commented himself publicly that she's not very comfortable with his agnosticism and his non-Christianity. I can only imagine the stress and difficulty in the marriage that would result if he were to suggest that Jesus didn't even exist, and started going publicly about this, that this might create problems at home. So there's no end to ulterior motives that are possible for why he's so emotional about this issue and so adamant on it. I don't claim to know. There could be any number of reasons. I don't see any trajectory in which he's heading towards believing Christianity. I think he has ordinary earthly secular reasons to be stuck on this.
Oh yeah, I agree. Okay, let's continue with the video. Huh? Oh, no, sorry. Apparently I had missed a question while I was looking.
Let's get that in.
Where's it at, hon? I did a member for 40 months question. Oh, sorry. I got it. It didn't show up in my chat. I can't make it appear on the screen. But sorry, my wife KC. Oh, it's from Iron Charioteer. Okay, so question from Iron Charioteer. Casey used her 40-month member chat to ask it, saying Jesus Christ is the only quote-unquote Messiah that has the name Savior, etymologically speaking. Is that a strong case for mythicism?
It's not a strong case, but it is grounds for suspicion, right? Mm-hmm. It warrants. It's one of those things that you like side eye that you're like, okay, maybe I should check into this, make sure this guy's real, because that is dubious. Now, I do make the point on the historicity of Jesus that it is entirely possible that there was a historical Jesus and that in life he was not called Jesus. He might have been Matthias or something. Like he might have had any random name, and that Jesus Christ is actually a label that was attached to him afterwards. for the same reason. Like he's the new Joshua, therefore we're going to call him Jesus. He's the Messiah, therefore we're going to call him Christ, etc. That is actually compatible with a historical Jesus. That could happen. It's totally believable. I think something similar happened to Peter, where his name is Kephas, which is not a name in Aramaic, but Paul refers to him by that as his name multiple times. Kephas means rock. So it's like Rocky. It's like a nickname. That sounds like a cultic name that Peter adopted for himself. And Peter means rock in Greek. So it's just the Greek translation of Kephas in Aramaic. So Peter, whoever he was, might have actually been Simon, like the Gospels say, right? The Gospels say it's Simon Peter. Jesus assigned the name to him. So the true story could be, like the actual history could be, that there was a Simon who started this religion. He claimed he had a vision of this celestial Christ figure who renamed him, says, "You are the rock of my mission now, so go forth and spread the gospel." And so he went around calling himself Rock because, God's Savior appeared to me in a dream and told me that's my name now. So that would be an example of a historical person who changed their name to something spiritually relevant. And we only know him by that name in the letters of Paul. So the same thing could have happened to Jesus. Jesus could have been a historical guy by who knows what name. And then because of what he went through and because of what people believed about him, they started calling him Jesus Christ, even though those weren't his names. And so the suspiciousness of the names does not decisively prove that it wasn't a historical person to which those names became attached. But it is grounds to be suspicious to actually check, right? It could be either one, right? Either one sound pretty plausible. So we should go check and see what the evidence is. In my experience, when you go check, it doesn't pan out. The evidence comes out pretty poor for a historical Jesus. But, that was my experience.
Yeah. And I had actually missed another super chat. Dragons in Genesis podcast said Nailed by David Fitzgerald and Jesus from Outer Space by Richard Carrier are required reading for this topic.
Yeah, I would mention, so Nailed by David Fitzgerald is a really good, funny, entertaining debunking of the divine Jesus, right? Like all the claims that Christians make about Jesus they don't hold up, and nor do mainstream scholars even think they hold up, right? So Nailed is really good on that one. Fitz has a follow-up. He has a series of Jesus mything in action. There's a couple volumes of that. The first volume is the best one, but if you really love that, you can get the other volumes too. There's a lot of cool shit in volume 1 of Jesus mything in action, where he focuses specifically on the mundane Jesus theory. Mostly, right? This mostly he's dealing with that. It's like, well, what if we reject, like Bart Ehrman does, we reject all the divine claims about Jesus? Is there still a Jesus left over that we can defend? And so he goes into like why that's not credible. But he does some other interesting things in there. And one of the things in volume 1 of Jesus Mything in Action that he does that I find is almost worth the book by itself is that he got a crew of people to literally call every university, I think in North America. I think they definitely did US. They might have done Canada too. I can't remember the exact count, but everyone that has a religious studies department, all of them, and ask them, do you require signing a contract swearing to support a dogma of your staff, basically? So any professor, there's a lot of, I think they came out with like 1 in 3 roughly. They find like tons of these schools, and some of them tried to avoid admitting that they did this, but they require their professors to swear that they will never contradict anything of the religious dogma that the school supports. And if they do, they'll get fired. So basically, you can't trust anything that comes from these professors because they have basically sold their soul. They've sold away their academic freedom. And so that kind of thing like discredits anything that they're trying to argue that touches on these issues that they would be fired for if they were to admit the truth, right? So so things like that, where he actually went out and did the freaking journalistic work and built the data and shows that like this is not a terribly reliable field. You have grounds to be suspicious when arguments are being made in a certain way, and you should fact check them. You shouldn't just assume anyone is telling you the truth. Now, this doesn't apply to Dr. Ehrman because he's not under one of these contracts, and nor would he be.
Well, so I've actually started, whenever I do a mythicist oriented like response video where I cover a video, I actually do a deep dive on like who the scholar is currently working for and everything like that. I have not, other than Bart Ehrman, which I haven't really done an exact response video to him about, but other than Bart Ehrman, I have not found a single scholar arguing on this particular topic that are not controlled by some kind of statement of faith.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not surprised by that. And that is a thing to take into account, I would say, for the audience.
Definitely. And to be quite honest, one of the things that kind of bothers me, and maybe you can correct me on this, but for Bart Ehrman, it seems like he's got like a bachelor's degree from a religious university, I believe, and then he's got a master's of divinity and then a PhD from Princeton Theological Seminary.
Correct. Yeah.
Which seems to me like it's pretty much just a mill for generating theological apologists.
True. I mean, a very sophisticated one, like one of the better ones, but true. He has no advanced degrees in history. This is true. Normally, I wouldn't harp on that, except for the fact that he keeps ragging on me for not having a degree in religious studies or New Testament studies. No, I have an actual degree in history, and he does not. So he shouldn't be throwing stones in this glass house.
Right. That's the only reason why I ever bring up like a scholar's credentials or whatnot is because of the fact that mythicists are constantly painted as being like uneducated, just internet people, right?
Right. You don't know what you're talking about. You don't have the relevant qualifications. Yeah. Dr. Ehrman has used this. He's used this argument a lot. And so the argument goes like this. Well, you're not qualified. And then you list this massive list of qualifications. Well, it's not specific enough. So fallacy of moving the goalposts, right? And then he keeps pushing this. And then you turn around and go, wait a minute. You don't have a degree in history. And he's like, oh, well, now they're suddenly making it about degrees and what specific subject you have. And like, no, you made it about that, you douchebag. And so, and this is, I'm not even joking. This is literally a sequence of events that has occurred multiple times with Dr. Ehrman and myself, and which I have documented on my blog. So yeah, he will literally complain about me pointing this out when in fact, he's the one who started this argument. He's the one who tried to make it about what degrees we had and what qualifications we had. He can't complain about the, turnabout is fair play. If he's going to start that argument, you really shouldn't start that argument if it's not going to end well for you. The response to that is not to complain about it. It's to mea culpa and say like, I really shouldn't have, you're right. I shouldn't have made that point.
All right. Ehrman has a little bit more on this point on Paul, on the celestial Jesus of Paul.
Paul knew Jesus' brother James, and Paul knew his closest disciple Peter. Look, the only way to write these things off is simply to have.
Notice he throws in the word disciple,
an agenda.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's not in
it
Paul,
always.
But, yeah.
That's one thing that really grinds my gears is when people are like, well, Paul knew disciples. It's like, no, he knew apostles.
Right.
They're the same thing. But
they're not. The words don't mean the same thing. Disciple would actually imply sitting at the feet of someone, because Matthias means like someone who's a student of a teacher. Apostolos, however, means someone who's sent. It means a messenger. Which is much more in concurrence with the idea of a revelation, which we see in First Clement, for example, and we see in Romans 10 in Paul's letters and stuff. The idea that Jesus appeared to people, delivered them a message and said, go forth and spread the message, because I can't. I'm appearing to you as a vision. I can't run around telling people. You got to run around telling people. So apostle actually is much more congruent with the revelatory cult, that you have to spread the message that you got mystically, whereas disciple would imply an actual historical person who collected students and taught them in life. So it is significant that Paul has no knowledge of the word disciple or of anyone being a disciple. That actually is relevant to this. The distinction between apostle and disciple matters for that reason, because of the underlying Greek and what those words mean.
where you are certain that there couldn't be a Jesus, and because you've got a reason for thinking that. There's nobody who would go into this open-minded, who would just look at the evidence and it would even occur to them. And
I was neutral on. So people don't know this. Like, people always don't look into my history. I was a rabid anti-mythicist. When I was the feedback editor for the Secular Web, I would shut this shit down and say, that is stupid. I'm working on my graduate degree in history. There, mainstream scholars all agree there's a historical Jesus. And of course, all the stuff I was seeing was like this crank mythicist bullshit. And it was easily debunkable as nonsense. And so I was very much against mythicism. I was hostile to it the way that Dr. Ehrman is here. Until someone several people convinced me to read Earl Doherty's book, The Jesus Puzzle. And then when I read that, I was like, well, that's actually a fairly competent argument. It has some flaws, but they aren't fatal. I would like to know what the historicists have to say to what he's doing. And I couldn't find a response to it. So I left I'll leave it on the table. I'm an agnostic at that point. So at that point, I'm agnostic. I could go either way based on how this debate plays out. And so I went into my postdoc research on the historicity of Jesus with an open mind. I was like, this could go either way. I was really teetering on either side of this and had been on the opposite side of it. And would have been happy to end up there again if I could really nail this. And people know I'm very pugnacious. If I had found adequate evidence for the historical Jesus, I would have made that my mantra, and I would have been Bart Ehrman here. Like, here's the reasons why mythicism is stupid. But no, I went into it with an open mind, and the further I went in, I was like, shit, this is actually a much better argument than I thought. And so that's how I ended up where I am. I was not a mythicist from the beginning.
I agree. I was not a mythicist either. And when I tried looking for concrete evidence, I found a very much a lack of concrete evidence that
every thread falls apart, right? You pull, this looks good, and then you pull it, and you're like, shit, that fell apart. Okay, and then you keep doing that, and at a certain point, you go like, okay, I'm seeing a trend here.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
And that's how I ended up where I am.
Yeah, me too.
I'm not talking about Christians. I don't know any historians who take this seriously.
He says this a lot. This is bullshit, and it really offends me that he keeps saying this. Because every time he says this, and he says it like year after year after year, I come out with a list of bona fide, qualified scholars who do say this, or who say it's plausible. They either say it's plausible, but they don't agree with it, or they're agnostic, or they're on board with it. And now I'm up to 20. I've got about 20 scholars that I've listed. You can go to my blog, look for Bart Ehrman recap, item 22 in there. I keep adding to that as more. And in fact, I think I have a few more to add coming up. No, the number's growing. So when he says, I don't know one, it's like, well, actually, at the moment that he says this, there were not one, but two separate scholars who published under peer review in major peer-reviewed biblical studies presses who are on board with this. So how can he claim he doesn't know one when there are two that he should definitely know about? Now, he's been called out on this multiple times. He should know about the other dozen or so. So it's definitely not none, but he keeps saying it, right? So it's like William Lane Craig keeps, after physicist after physicist points out that he's lying about the science, Craig will get up before an audience and repeat the same lies over and over again as if he'd never been rebutted. And this is extremely frustrating. It pisses me off. And here we have Bart Ehrman doing the same damn thing for no good reason. He's not even a Christian. Why is he doing this? I don't know. Why does he have to craft this lie and deny the existence of scholars, many scholars, who actually do think this is at least plausible or more than?
Yeah. And just so that people know, Dr. Carrier is one of the published authors under peer review, but the other one is Raphael Lataster's Questioning History, questioning the historicity of Jesus. And I actually got this for Christmas because it's a fairly pricey book.
Yeah, because that's the thing is when you buy from a serious peer reviewed academic press, they overcharge for their books. Yeah, and it's a major respected academic press. And Lataster has a PhD in religious studies, so he's no average Joe.
Not, and I mean, Lataster just utterly rips into Carrier, or not Carrier, but Ehrman,
Yeah.
On his imaginary sources and everything like that he uses. So yeah. But Casey wanted me to let everybody know that she's the one that got it for me for Christmas. Yeah.
That actually is a good get, because the book is expensive and it's hard to get otherwise.
Yeah, but I'm enjoying it so far, so I'm making my way through it.
Yeah, I recommend
hundreds of colleagues in history.
Oh, I'm
Go
sorry.
No, proceed.
Okay.
Yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt.
They aren't Christians. They just know how to do history. So why is it the mythicists make fun of us for doing history and think that, well, don't you realize that Jesus was crucified in heaven? Where are you getting that from? Besides somebody else who told you that. Yeah, and it's what you want to know. You want to believe it, so you believe it. Well, okay, I don't think there's a moon landing.
One of the pushbacks that I
see, that's one thing that really gets to me, is when they try to compare mythicism to these other conspiracy theories.
Yeah, right.
Because like these other conspiracy theories take
lists
an
3.
active.
Yeah, he does the moon landing. He's about to mention the Holocaust, and then he does the January 6th. Insurrection. So all of which are so massively well documented that if we had that kind of evidence for Jesus, we wouldn't even be here, right? So they're not just false analogies, they're just outrageously false analogies. And the Holocaust one is particularly offensive because there is Holocaust denial is a real phenomenon, and the evidence against it, like we have literally people who are alive today who are there, so like it is deeply offensive to say that you're gonna call this in and say like, well, anybody who doubts the historicity of Jesus is like a Holocaust denier. No, they aren't. Not in any possible metric. They're nowhere near the same thing. And frankly, stop using the Holocaust as an analogy, because that was actually a really horrible event that affected a lot of people in a bad way. And it's not, the denial of a Holocaust is actually politically fraught kind of issue that has no analogy, no bearing whatsoever to the Jesus historicity question. And it just shouldn't even come up.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Got in a comment was, well, just because Paul says he's born of a woman doesn't mean he was, but that's not the argument being made. It's saying that Paul saying that Jesus was born of a woman is proof that Paul is not arguing that Jesus is up in this heavenly realm exclusively.
Yeah. No. I mean, it's a weird thing to say he was born of a woman, but he has reasons to say it. But, it's not.
Oh, I like that he admits that it's a problematic statement. It is really weird, by the way. If you look at it, like, why would that? And all of he says that his reasons, but all the reasons that historicists advance make no sense in context. Like, it doesn't fit at all. For example, they'll say, oh, well, he needed to establish that Jesus was Jewish. It's like, what, everyone born of a woman is Jewish? That doesn't, I mean, not only he didn't say born of a Jewish woman, nor would that have made you a Jew in antiquity. This is a modern Israeli citizenship issue. When the nation of Israel was founded in 1948, maybe not, I don't remember when they decided their citizenship law, it might have been later, but they decided that it would be matrilineal because it's much easier to prove that someone was born of a woman than born of a man. This is before DNA patrimony testing, right? So, but that was a modern Israel national policy. It did not exist in antiquity. Being born of a Jewish woman did not make you Jewish. But it doesn't matter because Paul doesn't say a Jewish woman anyway. So why would he say a woman? Spoiler alert, he does say why. He literally does say why he mentions a woman. It just isn't what Dr. Ehrman wants you to think that he says is the reason.
Yeah. I
have the same exasperation, right? Yeah. But anyway, proceed.
get really upset that New Testament scholars don't take them seriously. I know that.
Mhm.
But you need to come up with better arguments.
We did. We did, Dr. Ehrman. We have way
Yeah.
better arguments than anything you've mentioned. If only you would pay attention to them. Yeah.
Yeah, and I like how he kind of harped on, well, you know, show me the verse where Paul says he was crucified in heaven, as if there's going to be an explicit reference.
Right. If we
somewhere in Scripture
had that, this
hasn't
wouldn't even be a
seen.
debate. Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Right.
And there's a reason we wouldn't have that, even if Paul would have said it, which there wouldn't be any reason for him to. Like, why would he's not going to anticipate 2,000 years later that people would get wrong what his theology was. But even if he did, that letter wouldn't survive. And we know there are letters of Paul that have not survived. He references them. So we don't get to read all of Paul's letters. Why don't we get to read all of Paul's letters? What do those letters that we don't get to read say? Legitimate question.
Yeah, I agree. Are you ready for the next clip? And I think it's probably going to be our final clip for tonight, because we do have one special clip after this.
Okay.
Huh?
All right.
It is going to be that one.
This one has really my goat. This is the great climax, because this one, for audience, watch this. Spot the fallacy. Just try to spot the fallacy. It's like a Jeopardy game. But anyway, proceed. Let's see this.
Yeah, which if this one isn't, I think this is the one that has the Q reference in it. If it's not, I do have the other clip that definitely has it in it.
All right, cool.
Was that it's possible that Luke was copying from Matthew rather than having a separate source, or that Matthew's copying from Luke, but you said that there's very, very good reasons to think that that's not happening.
Yeah.
What are those reasons?
Very good
Okay,
reasons. Go on.
Yeah.
Don't stop. Let it go.
Okay.
Just want to emphasize.
So Matthew and Luke and Mark, the three of them have many stories in common that are sometimes word for word the same. And so somebody's copying somebody. And there are pretty good reasons for thinking that Matthew and Luke both used Mark. It would take me 5 minutes to explain the reasons, but they're so convincing that since the 19th century, just about everybody who's tried to study this thing has said, yeah, that's probably right. Yep. Matthew and Luke also have a number of sayings of Jesus that they have in common that are not found in Mark. So they had some source for that, but it's not Mark. And so the question is, did Luke copy Matthew? Did Matthew copy Luke? Or did they both copy a different source? So the argument, I'm not sure I can do this very quickly, effectively, but I talk about this in a number of my books. When Matthew and Luke have these materials that are not found in Mark, they are almost always in a different sequence in their Gospels. So the Lord's Prayer will be here in Matthew and it'll be down here in Luke. The Beatitudes will be here in Luke and it'll be up here in Matthew. And so they're in different sequences. But the stories from Mark are almost always in the same sequence. What that suggests is that if Matthew had copied Mark and that Luke had copied Matthew, then it means that whenever Luke was copying Matthew, he had a copy of Mark on his lap and a copy of Matthew on his lap. And whenever he ever crossed the story in Matthew, he'd look up to see if it's in Mark. If it's in Mark, then he'd keep the order. If he saw it's not, he'd read through all of Mark to see it's not there, then he would change the order. I was like, what? Nobody writes a book like that. And so it's more likely that they both have some other source of sayings. They've got Mark, they copy Mark. They don't know what the sequence of sayings are. They're just like sayings. And so they plug them in at different places.
Okay. Oh my God. I don't even know where to begin with this. This is self-refuting. So let's start with the self-refutation. So he says that they wouldn't sit with the two books and take one in the sequence and one out of sequence. But by his own argument, they had to have, right? So if they had Mark and Q, and they would never dare take articles, take pieces out of sequence, then they wouldn't have taken anything out of Q out of sequence, right? So clearly they're doing the thing that he says, by his own argument, they're doing the thing that he says they would never do. So he's refuted himself. So they're using Q in the way that he claims they would never use Q. They're taking things and putting them out of order. And then he's using that as an argument that they would never do, that Luke would never do that to Matthew. So he's refuted himself. The argument is self-refuting. This is garbage history. I just can't even believe that he thinks that this is even an argument, much less a good argument, much less a very good argument. It's especially problematic because almost everything else he says is false. It is not true that Matthew and Luke keep Mark in the same order. They reorder pieces of Mark a lot, which actually refutes the same thing. It shows that they actually both look at Mark and are willing to reorder the text. Luke did that with Mark, so obviously he would do it with Matthew. There's no argument. His argument is not even factually premised. Like the premise is false. And then he says that it is crucial to his, you notice in the way he framed this argument, it's crucial that he says that Q is just this random collection of sayings. Absolutely false. 100% false. We have absolute concrete evidence that Q has narrative material, and that in fact, Matthew and Luke keep some of that narrative material in conjunction with the sayings. So a classic example is the Sermon on the Mount, which Luke turns into the Sermon on the Plain. I think it's both of them. I might be confusing one or the other, but there's two sequences of sayings in Matthew and Luke that are supposedly coming from Q, both of which are followed by the tale of the centurion immediately. So like the same sayings and then the centurion tale, same sayings and the centurion tale. So if they're using Q, first of all, that means that Q has narrative material. It's a gospel. It's not a collection. It's not a random collection of sayings. Or Occam's razor, Luke is just redacting Matthew, right? And so I just did a whole article on this about the idiocy of Q argumentation and Q apologetics. I go to my blog, richardcarrier.info. One of the most recent articles is about these stupid arguments for Q. And the ones there are actually not as stupid as the argument that Dr. Ehrman just gave just now, which is the stupidest argument for Q I have ever heard in my life, given that it's self-refuting as well as refuted by all the evidence that exists. If this is what he's like, this almost discredits his entire career. Like if he thinks this is a valid argument, how do we trust his judgment on frickin' anything? Like he can't even see the self-contradictory statements that he's just uttered. He doesn't know the basic facts of how Luke and Matthew used Mark. He doesn't know the basic facts of how they're using each other. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And there's no reason for him to not know what he's talking about here. It's not like he's some rando. He has the qualifications. He knows how to check these things. So why hasn't he? This is what frustrates me.
Yeah, I mean, I'm right there with you. It frustrates the hell out of me too, and it also frustrates me, this whole argument from sequences. How it seems to be a lot more speculation about it, because even if they did like order Mark in the same sequence, and they took and Luke took Matthew out of sequence, I mean, couldn't that just be authorial?
Yeah.
No,
that's absolutely a good point as well, right? Like the logic isn't even there, right? It's entirely possible that Luke would use Mark as the skeleton the same way Matthew did, and then picked at random from Matthew and inserted material. That's entirely in agreement with the way ancient authors work. There's no reason whatsoever to say that would even be implausible, even apart from all the things that I said already.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I think there's only like maybe a couple more seconds here. I don't know if he says anything, but there's only a little bit left.
And so that's the argument. It's the argument of sequence.
Yeah, so he just says that it's the argument from sequence, and I just I find it totally my mouth dropped when he was like, yeah, and that's pretty much the argument, that Luke did not use Matthew at all, and I'm just sitting here like, what in the hell?
No, there's no respectable reason for this argument to be coming from the mouth of this man. He should know better, honestly. He really does. He really should know better. He has the qualifications to know better. I can't answer it. I don't know what to say.
Yeah, nothing really much. The only other one, the one that we didn't get to tonight, was on Docetist, but it seemed a little inconsequential to.
We could do a whole show on Docetism, because I have a lot of thoughts about that. Because I think when he and other scholars say Docetism, they're using a modern construct that does not correlate with any ancient examples. And when they cite ancient examples, they're all different. So they're not one thing. And so they have these leaps of logic that don't make sense. And so I don't, and when you look at the actual evidence, I think they're using this concept as an excuse to avoid looking at the evidence as it actually is. And it creates deep failure modes in this. So we could do a whole show on Docetism, and it would be too hard to unpack in the time we have. So I think we've done a good run, though, on this. I think we've covered, certainly hit everything on my list that I wanted to talk about.
Okay, good. I'm glad. That was going to be my next question, if there was anything that we didn't cover. Because I do have one more clip to cover real quick, and it's something that I don't think that you've seen before, so this is going to be totally new.
Nice.
Yeah. I'm there is a super chat that we need to get to. It's the Mythic Life, and he says, could Dr. Carrier touch on Marcionite theology and how Marcion influenced Orthodox Christian scripture? Thanks.
Okay, not tonight, but we could do a whole show on Docetism and Marcionism. And what they really are, and how modern scholarship has gone beyond the evidence and sort of created these categories that didn't exist in antiquity. And it's really important. It ties into Gnosticism too, like the new Westar report on Gnosticism. I'm fully in agreement with, where there's a lot of like overturning of assumptions in these areas. So we could do a whole show on, it would be Marcionism, Docetism, Gnosticism, and their interaction, and answering this question is what was the influence of Marcionite theology on Christianity today? Like, what became the seeds of modern Christendom?
Yeah, I mean, I just got the green light from KC, so I'll be directly after this. We will be scheduling that up.
Awesome.
But there. Before we move on to the surprise clip, I do have one question that was posted in the for the Skeptic Mafia post, asking 4 questions. And this comes from Daniel M, who says, how does early Christians trying to change history affect Jesus mythicism? Does it help, hurt, or have no effect on trying to prove or disprove Jesus? And I think that maybe what he's getting at is like all of the very expert editorial decisions that were made on various sources that we have.
Well, you could use the example of Eusebius, for instance, where it's obvious Eusebius is faking a lot of history. Like he's taking disparate sources and making shit up. And there's a lot of rewriting of history. You can look at the way the Marcus Aurelius rain miracle, which was a pagan story, gets co-opted and turned into a Christian story, and so on. So there's a lot of historical revisionism, like almost Stalin-esque rewriting of history in the 4th century and 5th century, to a huge degree. And so I think the question is, well, we have concrete evidence that Christians were faking history all the time. 40 plus gospels, almost all of them are bogus. Half a dozen books of Acts, almost all are bogus. Like fabricating history was kind of their like modus operandi. That was their normal mode of doing things. And so the question is, like, does this increase or decrease the probability? Or I guess he was asking, does it increase the probability of mythicism, or does it have no effect? And what I would say is it increases it relative to the alternative universe in which that didn't happen, right? So, and so what the argument usually goes is, well, why would they make that up? It's like, well, look, they made shit up all the time, right? That's just the way they go. So that doesn't prove that they did it in this one case, but it does eliminate the argument against them having done it. And so that's why it is important to note the rampant falsification of history in early Christianity. That shows that, as basically proof of concept, making shit up is what they did. So you can't claim that they wouldn't do it. Like, that's no longer an argument against mythicism. And so that's how that plays out in the argument. In the end, I don't think it like hugely increases the probability of mythicism, but it does relative to a universe, an alternative universe in which Christianity didn't do that. But alas, they did. So that's the universe we live in.
Right. And then we've got a super chat from Daniel Bryce. It's just a blank super chat, just
Nice.
looking to support the stream. So thank
Awesome.
you so much there, Daniel. And that's going to be it. There was one other question, but I think that Jonathan Hanachek was targeting somebody else, maybe with the question.
Well, I'll just say, like, while we've got the audience in there, if you want to support more shows like this, especially shows with me coming on, I rarely have time anymore to do this stuff, so I actually do charge now. So throw money to Godless Engineer, right? Like, if you want to see more content like this, make it worth his while. So yeah, throw some super chats in there. Or do you have a Patreon that you can direct them to?
Well, I do have a Patreon, although you get more out of the memberships here.
Right. So right, yeah, get in on that. Yeah, I highly recommend it. I always have a good time on your channel, and you do good work on here. So
now I you know, I don't exactly have conversations like the James Valiant debate, but you know. I figure you have a pretty good time here.
I do. Yeah, no, I'm always delighted to be on.
Yeah. All right. So I'm gonna go ahead and start this last clip. I want to say thank you to everybody that's done a super chat. If you guys don't know, a portion of the super chats and everything here goes to a charity and also goes to putting on great shows with like Dr. Carrier here. Yeah. So becoming a member is a great way to support the channel, but also doing super chats and everything like that is going to help us out. I do believe this month we're jumping in on the RFR, the RFR fundraiser, Recovering from Religion. We're going to be helping out with that. This month.
That's important. People should look into that if you don't know what it is. I've actually had a few people just recently in the last few months who've reached out with religious trauma and issues like, what do I do? I'm trying to get away from and get past the damage that was done to me by my religious background. And I always refer them to RFR, right? The Recovering from Religion. They've built resources for this because you're not alone. And in fact, people are often surprised. They say like, oh, I didn't know there was an organization. I didn't know so many people had been through the same thing I had. Like, yes, they have. And they've organized and they're there to support you.
Yes, definitely. And I'm putting it up on the screen right now, but Saturday, February 19th of this month, your friendly atheist, Ethan, is going to be putting on his second annual YouTube fundraiser for Recovering from Religion. And I'm going to be on that later on in the day. And so we're going to be, targeting our charity efforts towards RFR this month. So
yeah, I totally support them and what they're doing. I think they're doing a good job.
Yeah. So Dragons for Genesis podcast said, support content creators.
Yes.
And then Daniel Bryce sent another super chat saying
okay,
the first
so
was a UI error.
Write this down, and this will be a question you ask me on this future episode that we just conceived.
Okay.
Because that will tie right in. That will tie right into that same thing. Yeah. Can't answer Daniel tonight, sorry.
Right, we can't answer it tonight, but Daniel Bryce asked, what are Dr. Carrier's thoughts on the hypothesis that Luke originated at the lost Marcionite gospel, which a proto-Orthodox author doctored it and went on to write Acts? I hadn't actually heard of that.
I have a lot of thoughts. Yeah. We actually have multiple wildly different redactions of Luke Acts. So there's precedent. Anyway, lots of thoughts. We can bring it up in that future episode.
Yeah, Daniel is funding a future stream. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's what I encourage. I encourage folks doing that. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Cadence says, whatever, here's some money. Thank you, Cadence. And then we've actually got a new member. The Deviant Outcast became a member. Sweet. So thank you so much there, Deviant Outcast. All right, so let's get to this last clip. Now, normally I wouldn't bring this up, but I attended was it the GCRR
Yeah.
it was an all day long not seminar. I'm trying to think of the word.
Well, there was the last one, which was about religious trauma, I think.
Right. But
Which
there was one before
I
that.
wasn't able to attend that. But then the one before that, I think, is the one that I gave a talk on. And I actually literally stayed up and watched every single one of the presentations.
Yeah.
It was hardcore.
Well,
It was awesome, actually. I highly recommend people go to their website and watch. You can pay to watch past conferences, and it's totally reasonable. It's not an outrageous cost.
Right. And this one reminds me a lot of actually Lataster's presentation on this, where he talks about both your work and his work and the responses to it.
Yeah.
So this was posted in a Facebook like Mythicist versus Historicist group. So
there are a couple of people who are not just conspiracy theorists, but who are holding to the idea that Jesus is entirely a mythical creation, and that retains some proponents. I think the most popular person on the internet is Richard Carrier. His work.
Yeah.
He's got the wrong book. He's showing the wrong book. That's not in that book. That book does not argue that.
Right.
He's got the wrong. He's ignoring the other side of the error margin, and then claims they're arbitrary. It's not arbitrary. There's a whole book that argues for these things. The opposite of arbitrary is a conclusion that is argued for. The whole book is arguing for these things. That is the opposite of arbitrary. But anyway, yeah, I love these ridiculous claims.
Yeah. So this is his name is John Harmer. And he works for the people that put this out. I can't remember the organization, but he works for them. But the thing is that he's officially just a pastor. He talks about having some kind of historical, like he's a history type of person, but he's really only ever got, from what I can tell, degrees in theology, making him a pastor.
Sure.
So
yeah.
We got a couple of super chats here from Jonathan, who says, "Hell yeah!"
Nice.
And
666, very good.
Yeah, I have. So I've got this alternate version of myself.
I see the question that already came up.
Yeah. So I've got this ultra personality I call Brocephus, and he does all of the alerts here on the channel. And so for $6.66, I have him saying something about how somebody's going to hell. And so that's why 666 is kind of an odd one. But Marcos Gonzalez says, "Love your work, Dr. Carrier. Just a quick question. Why are you so awesome?"
Years of effort, I guess. I don't know. Knowing what to take seriously and what not to take seriously, I think, is the key.
Yes, exactly. I agree. And then we got MathWiz742 became a member. Thank you so much for supporting the channel there. Appreciate you. All right, let's get back, because he goes through it a little bit more, and he has
really.
Yeah.
He's written several books. One of them is called Proving History.
I'm sorry, what was that?
Where did you find this, by the way? Like, how did you?
Oh, it was in the Mythicist versus Historicist group.
Got it. Right, you did mention that. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So somebody put it in there. It's actually 2 hours long, but you come up in a short 2-minute segment.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. It provides, I think, scientific seeming results. And so one of the things that he does is he takes a theorem to make kind of an equation that generates like odds that he's like trying to calculate. And one of them, he calculates that there's as little as 1 in 12,000 odds that Jesus is a historical figure. But this methodology, as all historians have kind of commented on it and written on it, is entirely faulty. He created an equation. History isn't a math problem. The reason why you get numerical results out of this equation is that Richard Carrier has to assign arbitrary numerical values on the input. Then you run it through the equation and you get the answer and the output. And so essentially garbage in, garbage out, the results are meaningless.
I mean, that would be a valid critique if it were true. That's
Right.
like Bayes' theorem can be used that way. It can be GIGO. Like you can have garbage in, garbage out. But same with logic, right? You know, the Kalam cosmological argument is garbage in, garbage out. But it's clear this guy has never read anything I've written. He has no idea what I'm actually doing, or why it's impossible to avoid Bayes' theorem in history. Because if you're going to make any assertion about history, it's an assertion about a probability. And I'm sorry to tell you, so sorry to tell you, probability is math. Right. So you can't talk about probability if you're not willing to do the math or figure out how the math of probability works.
Right.
And so that's true for everybody.
Exactly. And the reason why this reminded me of Lataster's presentation is because Lataster's presentation at that particular conference was on the responses to both his and your work.
It was.
And one of the main themes running through all of it was that they didn't actually read your work, and they took the least charitable conclusion that you drew.
Case in point, he picks the lower bound of my margin of error. Doesn't mention that I actually have margins of error, and much less what the top margin of error is. Yeah. So no, because this is a classic example of poisoning the well. This is a well poisoning fallacy. The whole idea of which is pick the most absurd thing that you could cherry pick from what someone said and try to illustrate, what they're saying is absurd because here's this conclusion. But of course, what he's trying to say here is that how dare I be so specific when in reality I was not. I was explicitly not this specific. I said my margin of error is between that and 1 and 3. Mm-hmm. That is a huge range of ambiguity. That is the exact opposite of specific. And so what they've done is they've erased what I actually did and have contrived a false version of what I did, all in order to dissuade people from ever finding out what I actually did by trying to convince them that what I did is absurd, even though it wasn't. And that's a well poisoning fallacy. It's a common and effective rhetorical strategy, especially for people who aren't critical thinkers.
No, yeah, I totally agree. And kind of a not even relevant to what we're discussing, but a super chat from Denny says, I scored some bonus meatloaf at Cracker Barrel. They brought me the wrong shit. Score for bonus meatloaf.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
The chances that Carrier's methodology has any value at 0%. So I mean, there's a statistic.
0%.
I think it's funny because you actually have an entire thing where you're like, never pick 0.
It can't be 0%. It's impossible. Yeah, I know.
Right. It doesn't mean that there's nothing to it. There's another prominent mythicist, Robert Price, who's much more methodologically sound.
That he would admit that. That he would try to boost Price. That's not going to help him. That's interesting.
Yeah. Well, and I find it interesting that he chooses Price to say that he's more methodologically sound when, I would think that he would pick the other peer-reviewed person when it comes to the agnostic.
Most people don't know that exists. So, and this guy clearly has never read anything I wrote. So he's not actually informed. He doesn't know what he's talking about. So he probably doesn't even know about Lataster, which is a shame because I think it's crucially important to look at Lataster's work. But to not even know about it is a tragedy. Because Price is not published under peer review. He hasn't done any Jesus myth stuff in anything other than his own journal, which is would normally not be promoted for that reason. But it's still, if you're saying that Price is I'm down with him saying Price is more methodologically sound, because if he believes that and is promoting that to his audience, that's encouraging his audience to go read Price's stuff, and like I said, that's not going to end well for him.
Yeah.
means, generally speaking, that he kind of has to retreat to skepticism. Obviously, the skeptic defense is always the most defensible. So when you don't make any assertions and you just say, well, we're skeptical that anything happened, when he's agnostic on the historical Jesus, that's the most defensible position. Although we have to be then amazingly skeptical of the mythicist position, which is, comparatively just immensely less likely. So this is the reason why there's a historical consensus.
I mean, I feel like the reason why...
Who is this guy? What is this video for? It doesn't seem to be evangelical. It seems to be for a more liberal Christian audience or something. I don't know the context of this video.
Yeah, well, so it seems really weird that this guy comes from more of the liberal sort of
I'm getting
Christian
that impression.
Congregation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I mean, I picked this and I wanted to get your thoughts on it just because he does such a poor job of representing your position.
Yeah, well,
but
that's always frustrating. But yeah,
yeah. But it's just he did a 2-hour lecture for, and I'm trying to find the post right now. It should come up because it was fairly recent.
Yeah, you said it was 2 hours. That's long. I assume it's on historical Jesus.
Yeah, pretty much. He's pretty much just laying out the historical Jesus, and this is where you came up in it. But he spends 2 hours on this particular topic of, like, I guess what we can know about the historical Jesus. Let's see. Open link in browser.
All right, so we should aim to wrap within the next 10 minutes, I think.
Yes, we are. There's another super chat question. Yeah, sorry. Hold on. This is for the center place. And there's not really a lot of information given about it other than he's just talking about the historical Jesus.
Okay. Never heard of it. But all right, proceed.
Yeah. Oh, that's it. That's all. So we're actually done with all the videos.
Oh,
and stuff.
All right, awesome.
Yeah.
That's been good. I think we handled and covered the Bart Ehrman Q&A video really well. So I think this is a good video to direct people to for that reason.
Oh, okay. He did it. Oh, okay. I see. So there's a super chat that was kind of got mixed up with it. The question from the super chat is, Richard, would you agree that Romans' control over Israel had to do in part with the softening of the New Testament versus the Old Testament?
I don't even know what that means. When the New Testament existed, Israel didn't. So I don't know what that means. Judea had been destroyed at that point. It was turned into a province. Well, I can't remember when the province was renamed Palestine, but Jerusalem was destroyed, uninhabited. Jews were banned from Jerusalem, and the treaty that Judea had with Rome was dissolved. So everything changed in 70 AD, basically. And then changed even worse after the 140s when the Bar Kokhba revolt occurred, but late 130s and early 140s. But so the New Testament comes after that. Like the New Testament, what we mean by the New Testament as a collection of books, arose after the Bar Kokhba revolt. So that's after the final destruction of anything resembling Judea as a province.
Yeah. Well, thank you for talking about that. I wasn't sure what they could be meaning, but
yeah, I don't. Right, I assume they had some other intent that wasn't perfectly conveyed by the phrasing of the question, but maybe in a future video they can join in and rephrase, and we'll go. But
yeah, and we'll be setting that up in the coming months, and so I know that you've got a lot of stuff going on, but I really appreciate you coming
crazy
on tonight.
Busy.
Yeah,
but yeah,
I really
I'm very grateful for you having me on and giving me the opportunity to talk about this, and you're always a pleasure. I love you as a host.
Yeah,
you're much more. You see, you put in the work. You're actually like. You actually know what you're talking about. So
Well, yeah, on this very specific subject, I definitely know what I'm talking about. But I've got updates for the Crestus app, and I know I want to say that I think that you've got some updates that may be in the pipeline.
Not
some
anytime
notes
soon.
or something.
No.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've got a lot of work to do on it as well. So I've got updates that are coming out that I'm working on.
Good. Yeah,
And
I'd love to see like an act. Yeah, some what do you call it? Published updates on that. I'm a long way from finding time to contribute. So,
right, yeah.
But that's
well, I mean,
my life is crazy right now.
Well, so for iOS, it takes it's very difficult to get like an update like queued up and everything like that.
I know what
So
it's like.
I'm trying to get that done, but the updates are coming, and as soon as I get over this one little hump, they should be flowing pretty frequently. So, but I do want to say I really appreciate you coming out and handling all these this reaction from Bart Ehrman and everything like that. I don't mean any ill will towards Holy Koolaid, and I think that he's kind of in an area where he's kind of out of his depth a little bit, in my opinion.
Right,
but
that could be, yeah.
But in any case, I appreciate you, Dr. Carrier, and for all you heathens out there, I appreciate you guys watching. If you will, leave a comment down below. Let us know what you thought about Bart Ehrman in the clips that we showed, or in any of our responses. Let us know down below in the comments, and subscribe. If you're not already subscribed, that helps us out here to donate to charities like Recovering from Religion. They're a great organization, and we'll be focusing our charitable efforts on that this month. So Carrier, you want to remind everybody where they can find you? We're going to have all your links down in the description right after this, so definitely show yourself out.
richardcarrier.info. So Richard Carrier, all one word, .info. Carrier is spelled just like the word, so it's easy to find me.
Awesome. All right. Well, we're going to head on out. I know Carrier's got other things to do. And so I've got to go and get some food in me. My phone's yelling at me for some low blood sugar. And I guess we will see you heathens next week. Bye, y'all.